Thank you all for joining me. My name is Ian, and I'm in charge of product here at Merkle Science. You're going to be seeing me a couple of times today, usually before lunch or break, so don't come to hate me. But I'm very excited to spend some time with you guys. Now, obviously, if you're coming to a Merkle Meets event, you can't escape spending some time looking at our product, right? And so that's really what I'm going to be spending my time with you guys today, walking you through some of the different tools that we've built here at Merkle and how that can contribute in building a safer Web3 ecosystem, right? And in this first session that I have prepared for you guys, I'm going to be talking a little bit about our Compass solution, which is designed as a wallet and transaction monitoring tool. Now, Merkle has been around in this space for quite some time. We were founded back in 2018, and I can tell you the transaction monitoring space has changed dramatically from back then to where we are today. Right? I'm very excited to say that the market has matured a lot. Back in 2018, when we tried to sell this software to companies, half the time I would get the response, what is blockchain monitoring? And once I educated them, the next question would be, well, why do I need it? Right? Because back in 2018, everybody thought they could do whatever they want, and it would be okay. Today, we know better. Right? We see an industry filled with experienced compliance experts like yourselves, and thankfully, that's what keeps us in business. So just a little bit about the history, right? And I want to talk about, some of the unique features about blockchain and cryptocurrency that makes transaction monitoring so effective. A lot of people have this false misconception that, blockchain is only used by criminals, it's difficult to monitor, there's nothing we can do to protect our business, but that is not true. In fact, because of blockchain, because of the technology that it's built on, we actually today have access to so much more data, which allows us to build more effective monitoring and compliance programs, right? And two components of blockchain and cryptocurrency that allows this to be possible is the fact that, number one, transactions on the blockchain are publicly available in most cases, right? Obviously, we have your privacy-enabling blockchains, but in most cases, transactions are always publicly available. And with that, what that means is that transactions are also traceable, right? We are not limited to analyzing, just direct counterparties when we're trying to screen for source of funds. We have the ability to go beyond, right, in order to see who is the ultimate sender or recipient of any given transaction. And it's because of what the technology allows, and this has really influenced how blockchain monitoring has evolved. Right. So in 2018, when we were building blockchain monitoring systems, everybody's focus was simply on identification of where funds were coming and going. And this was heavily reliant on companies like us building large attribution data sets, right? Saying that, hey, we know all the dark and market addresses, we know all the sanction addresses, and so we'll tell you if your clients are sending funds from this list. But that had obvious limitations, right? Because if you are screening transactions based on a prescribed list, what happens when this list becomes public, right? And it doesn't really help sometimes that the OFAC publishes all the addresses that they know criminals control, because what does that mean? Well, you're simply telling the criminal, maybe I should create a new address, right? Because everybody already knows this one is bad. So how do we overcome the challenges of just relying on a database? Well, this is where we can fall back on how traditional transaction monitoring is typically conducted, right? Where if you think about in the context of a bank, yes, banks have in place systems to identify where the funds are coming from. We have SWIFT trying to solve for that problem. But transaction monitoring in the typical sense usually also involves the analysis of transaction behavior, right? And as we see the market matures, we start seeing regulators around the world start mandating that blockchain monitoring also takes into account behavioral indicators. And this was and this really started out in 2019 when the FATF started releasing publications on what constitute red flag indicators in the crypto space. And as you can imagine, a lot of it defaulted back to your traditional transaction monitoring indicators, such as velocity, abnormal spikes in deposit activity that don't correlate with customer background, etc. And one of the things that really made Merkle famous in this space was that we were the first blockchain analytic company that actually combined both approaches, right? Where we took the traditional source of funds approach and we introduced the behavior monitoring that the traditional compliance space was used to. right? So initially it looked like this. It's just identifying where funds are coming from. And then over time, we introduced behavior. So what does that look like from a tool perspective? So this is the interface of the Compass solution that we've developed. As you can see, if you're a user logging in, immediately you'd be able to identify how many alerts were created across all the different blockchains that we support. And one of the great things about our solution is that we stress a lot on customizability. We recognize that the space for blockchain monitoring is constantly evolving, right? As much as we've learned a lot about how traditional transaction monitoring has been done, and as much as we try to take the same approach to cash monitoring to crypto, the reality is that it is a little bit different, right? The way that people move crypto is very different from the way that people move cash. If you were to simply apply all the traditional rules that you take for monitoring cash onto crypto, I can tell you, a lot of your clients' accounts are going to flag and look suspicious, right? Simply because of the way that these crypto users transact. So the way that the Compass solution works is, most of our clients, when they're screening transactions, they're sending us this information via API in real time. And what we are able to do is identify if these transactions are coming or going from illicit actors, or if the transaction behavior itself is suspicious. And the way that we've designed the solution as well is that we recognize that a lot of our clients, right, they operate in many different jurisdictions. If we take Crypto.com as an example, they're licensed in half a dozen jurisdictions across the world. And from a business perspective, for the CEOs in the room, that's great, right? If I have a business operating in half a dozen countries, awesome, right? That's how big my client base is. If you're a compliance officer in the room, you're probably not so happy, right? You're telling me I have to comply with 6 different regulatory frameworks. I have to monitor for how governments are changing regulations across 6 different jurisdictions, and I have to screen my customers' activity across 6 different frameworks. Nightmare. Well, to make that easier for you guys, in the Merkle platform, we have this concept of something called workspaces, where essentially each workspace is a separate instance within the tool. So if you're operating in 5 different countries, you could have a US workspace, a UK workspace, and have different set of rules in each workspace that's commensurate to that jurisdiction's local framework. The other thing that we stress a lot here at Merkle is the need for a flexible and customizable risk detection model. So here in Merkle, our tool has this concept of what we call a risk policy. And you can think of a policy as simply a accumulation of rules, right? So if you as a compliance officer wanted to create a new policy to adopt to, let's say, some of the local regulations, all you need to do is click Add Policy, give it a name, give it a description, and then click Add Policy to create it, right? So we've intentionally designed it in such a way that there is no coding needed, right? Compliance officers can modify and create rules on the fly by themselves. Now, once a policy has been created, all you need to do is click into the policy itself. You can review the rules inside it, but then you also have the flexibility to add rules on the go, right? And again, everything is done without any coding required. You can simply tell the tool, I want to create a rule to detect, let's say, sanction evasion, where if an address has directly received payments from, let's say, sanction actors of a certain amount, threshold, and then if I click Save Rule, voila, we have a rule that's deployed immediately. Now, the beauty about the system that we've developed is that we understand that risk constantly changes, right? And our clients are at the front line of observing what are some of the new typologies that these criminals are using in order to launder their funds. And so very intentionally, the way that we've designed our system is that we want to allow our clients to pick and choose from a bunch of different behavior and alert indicators in order to detect for more complex typologies. And let me give you an example of how that works today. So, quick case study. One of our clients, which you guys might be familiar with, it's a little company called Consensus. right? And they've built this little app that some of you may or may not have heard of called MetaMask, right? Now, as you can imagine, a lot of people use MetaMask to interact with a lot of their DeFi applications. And one of the challenges that Consensus had identified from last year was that there was a couple of incidents in the past where bad actors such as DPRK had targeted their smart contracts as a way to launder funds, right? And so one of the great things about the transparent nature of the blockchain was that we could actually sit down with them in order to analyze the behaviors in which these bad actors had interacted with their platform. And so what we observed was, well, what would the bad actor do? Step number one, they would create a new wallet, right? Like I mentioned, these criminals are a little bit smarter today. They're realizing I don't have to use the same wallet every time. I can create a new one every time I interact with a service provider. Unfortunately, creating a wallet is not enough, right? Because you have to fund it with the assets that you want to launder, right? So next thing that they do is they will immediately fund that new wallet with the stolen assets before then seeking to conduct a swap with MetaMask to convert that asset into something like a stable coin. And then they run away, right? And unfortunately today, in most instances, these criminals still get away with the theft. But this is where, we're trying to come in to prevent such situations. So what do? Well, we basically sat down with the Consensus team and we worked with them to design a set of behavior indicators to detect such instances, right? So the first thing that they noticed was that typically the wallets interacting with their smart contracts would receive payments of more than 100,000, right, within the last 24-hour period, right? So like I was saying, they would need to fund their wallet. The wallet that they created would also be new, right? So we can add another condition if this wallet was also created in the last 24 hours. And then after funding the newly created wallet, they would then conduct a swap with MetaMask. So we could add a third condition. If the address has received payments from Consensus or MetaMask in an aggregate of more than 100,000 in the last 24 hours, right? So this perfectly describes the activity that I mentioned previously in terms of how some of the bad actors have been interacting with their platform. What we then did after coming up with these set of behavior indicators was we then built the ability for them to automatically monitor their smart contracts, right? So here's the thing about blockchain monitoring that's different from, let's say, traditional transaction monitoring. As a service provider in this space, I don't have to wait for my clients to tell me when a transaction has happened in their business, right? If my clients simply tell me the wallets that they are using, we can independently monitor those wallets on the blockchain. And so by building out a smart contract watch list, we allowed Consensus to basically upload every one of their liquidity pools, their aggregator contracts, and every time somebody interacts with those smart contracts, we would automatically screen those transactions against the rules that I had described. And with that, we're very proud to say that in a very recent incident where UX Link was hacked, Consensus actually shared with us that we had successfully blocked 3 transactions from the attacker in an attempt to launder their funds through their smart contracts. And if any of you are interested to learn more about how this works, we did do a webinar with them previously, and more information can be found on the Merkle site. Now, last thing that I want to show you guys, coming back to the tool, is what you would typically then see if you were relying on Compass to screen an address. So Compass adopts a couple of different workflows, right? Most of our clients are simply sending us addresses and transactions to screen. But as you can imagine, if you're an exchange client, your clients aren't just screening, transactions on Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? They're probably trading a bunch of different tokens on your platform. And so very importantly, within the platform, we do have the option for you to create customer IDs where you can aggregate your customers' transactions across different blockchains. And the benefit of this workflow is that we would then run the rules that we've developed across all the transactions linked to the different wallets of the customer. Now, from a results perspective, then, if you were to simply screen an address in the tool, you could click on that address, and Compass would immediately tell you what's the risk level based on the number of open alerts that we've identified, right? So the number of alerts that this address had triggered based on an analysis of its entire transaction history. If we know who controls the wallet, we will tell you the owner, as well as the type, right? So in this case, this is a wallet that's actually been sanctioned by the OFAC on 2022, March the 26th, right? On the right, we will also give you a breakdown of the address's historic activity, so all the different tokens that it might have traded, when those transactions had happened, as well as then a list of the alerts that were triggered. Now, we recognize that in most cases, compliance officers may not be investigators, right? And whilst we do have a dedicated investigation tool, within Compass, we've also taken the liberty to introduce an automated transaction investigation graph. And what the graph typically does is, it would automatically map an address's exposure to all known actors, good or bad, right? And so we can see over here that this address had, for example, receives funds from another OFAC sanctioned address, and it was also interacting with many different service providers, right? And being an interactive graph, users can click on the link in order to get more detailed information about when these transactions had taken place. Now, the goal of any tool, of course, is not just highlight risk, but is to provide you with the information needed to evaluate the risk. And so if, let's say, you have a rule that's been triggered for, let's say, indirect high-risk activity, you always have the option of just clicking on the alert. And we also take the liberty of then providing you a filtered version of the graph, specifically as to why this alert had flagged, right? So the goal with tools today, I think, is to really focus on automation. With the number of transactions that these exchanges are processing, it's impossible for you to maintain a team that's reviewing all of this in real time. And so it's important for you to have a system that is flexible enough that allows you to configure and modify alerts on the fly in order to take into account how criminals are changing the way that they're laundering funds. And once an alert has been generated, it's also very important that you have all the information as quickly as possible in order for you to perform your assessment. And so once everything has been done on the Compass platform, you do have the ability to automatically generate a report. And for those of you who are familiar with interacting with regulators, we also have a very detailed audit trail within the tool that basically logs every time an action is taken in relation to an address or an alert. And so if needed, all of this can be generated in the form of a report as well, attached to your client documents, or simply stored for record-keeping purposes. Compass has a lot more bells and whistles. As the product manager, I would love to spend another 6 hours with you guys, walking you guys through every single one of them, but that was turned down, right? I only have a couple more minutes with you guys. So with that said, I will end the presentation here for now and open the floor to questions if there are any. Oh, wow, okay, we'll start with the gentleman in front. Yes?
Sorry, I should probably know this already, but you guys deal with, obviously, jumps between chains, right? So within all of the chains that you have, you can also see what's been bridged.
Correct.
Right? Because I think I used the tool and it looked at that. But then problems, because this is all legacy kind of based, right? So, for example, let's take the Polygon Ethereum bridge. That's been used a hell of a lot. But I noticed there was a lot of taint from even just regular people using that bridge for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you deal with that over time? Because it's obviously a legacy issue, and it's not necessarily a bad actor issue, and it's not as simple as a mixer, which is sanctioned. It's just a service, right? So how do you see that being dealt with in terms of compliance? Because it's a tricky one, right?
So a lot of times I think it's really a business decision, right? At the end of the day, right? How a company chooses to tackle it. We have seen instances where if funds are coming from a mixer, clients would simply evaluate the mixer itself, right? Similar to how they might evaluate a DEX, right? Because recognizing that DEX kind of operate as a mixer because they don't do KYC and they kind of aggregate funds from the.
Not all of them.
Not all,
Yeah.
yes, not all, right? But oftentimes it's still a business decision, right? If they are unable to satisfy the ability to trace past, then they will simply say, okay, how comfortable are we with receiving funds from this entity, right? Do we think that this entity have in place certain checks and balances in order to identify who's using their service, right? And today there are quite a number of service providers today on the different blockchain platforms that we work with, where we work with them to monitor, like what I showed you, all interactions with their smart contracts, right? So that's one approach. The other more conservative approach that we see clients take is simply, you know what, if it's coming from somewhere where I cannot gauge the risk appropriately because, you know, if we go beyond, there's just too many transactions, they might simply choose not to interact with the business. Yeah.
Wow.
Yes. Which is a problem, right? Because, you know,
Problem.
it is a big problem. Yes.
Because that's quite simplified, right? And would that be out of the box? Sorry to ask another question, but like, is that a standard setting out of the box that, or would they have to configure that?
They would have to configure. So within the tool, we have the option, right? Users can designate, you know, these are some of the providers that we are comfortable with, that we want to allocate a lower risk score, and then these are a list of providers that, you know, we know through publications that they have a history of being used by certain bad actors, and so we just don't want to touch funds coming from them.
Right.
Yeah. So everything is customizable within the platform. Yeah. Question in the mid. Sure. And then we'll go to you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hi, can we do a quick test? Can you please scan this address in your software?
Our software doesn't allow for scanning of QR codes over here.
I can send you this address. It's a Tron address. I'm just curious how we will display it here.
Okay, we will circle back to that.
Yeah, sure.
And then in the event I cannot show you after this immediately, just follow me to the corner and then we can take a look at it. Yes.
Can a user create their own conditions on new syntax than the one you showed?
So today, no, unfortunately. They are restricted to the conditions that we have. But we do have the ability to create new conditions fairly quickly. So with a lot of our clients, we do sit down with them every 6 months, understand what are some of the new behaviors that they're looking at, and then we introduce it. We are exploring with the use of AI to allow users to create their own rules using NLP, but that's still quite a ways off. Yeah. And then I think we had a question at the back. Yes.
Just a very simple one. You showed us the rules, and one of the rules was if the wallet had been created within 24 hours. And I was wondering how you determine that. Is that quite simply you haven't seen that transact on the blockchain?
Correct. So we look at its first transaction. Yeah, which in the case of a new wallet might not have any, but if it's created with, let's say, a smart contract, then there would still be an initial funding transaction to create it. Yeah. Yes.
I was surprised when you said that North Korea is making swaps directly in MetaMask, because I wouldn't do it because there's more fees than on other exchanges, because MetaMask will take a fee on top. So how sophisticated are the criminals?
Oh.
Are they, because when I look at the hacks are usually very sophisticated. Hard work. How sophisticated are they really?
I think there's a big gradient, right? You have, of course, your very sophisticated bad actors, and then you have people who are just stealing funds and moving it into an exchange in 1 or 2 hops, right? And the reality is that majority of the crime, not looking at dollar value amounts, let's look at instances, most of them are actually quite simple, right? If you're looking at the theft of, you know, individuals from other individual wallets, those are usually very simple, right? And with our auto trace capability, with our investigation tool, a lot of it can be easily tackled by that. But then you have your nation state actors, right, who might be using, you know, hundreds of different wallets in order to layer their funds, using smart contracts to automate the movement through the use of mixers. Those then become a lot more challenging, right? And my personal opinion, people in this room may not agree with me, but my personal opinion is there are ways to move funds in cryptocurrency where nobody will ever be able to track you. I think that is always going to be around, right, through the use of privacy tokens, decentralized platforms. There are ways that, you know, we just cannot catch them, But as an on-chain analytics company, all we can do is do our best and try to close that gap as much as possible. But until we get away with decentralized mixtures, until we completely get rid of privacy tokens, there are always going to be ways in which these really sophisticated actors can move funds that can never be traced.
Can I have one more question? In general about Merkle Science, have you ever been hired by any company to research if transactions on a certain platform or blockchain are just as scam transactions just to generate volume and user activity? Because there's millions there's tons of them. Have you ever been hired to detect it?
So are you saying that if your question is, have we been hired to look at a token across the entire blockchain in order to identify if the transaction volumes are real or fake?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, we have done such studies before.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
I will take one more question and then we can go to our little corner. Yes.
Sorry, because essentially what you're looking at is wallets, right? So when you said you looked at smart contracts, it's really just the wallet of the smart contract that you're looking at.
Correct.
I mean, talking about more sophisticated ones, you're looking at code injection, right, into those smart contracts. But you could also, I'm not trying to give you product ideas, but wouldn't that be,
I will happily take them.
but wouldn't that be the next level to see whether the code has been injected into and whether there's been a state change in that? Because that's the more sophisticated one, right? And that's the bigger vulnerability, because most users would never even see that before it had happened. There's been lots even recently of big companies I won't name, but where they've been left with long faces because of that.
Correct. So one of the solutions that we have allows you to identify potentially malicious smart contracts by looking at the code to see if they have any lines that perhaps give the creator adverse permissions that should not be there.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. But that's a little bit harder because we can only do that effectively for a number of different blockchains today because it's heavily dependent on the coding language as well. Right? But this is where we see the potential of AI to come in, right? Because once you can define the different, let's say, commands that you're looking for, hopefully AI would be able to translate that to the different languages and then detect that on different blockchains as well. Yeah. But that is something that we are still researching. All right. I appreciate the questions.
One maybe simple, very question. Talking about your case specifically with consensus. You said
Yes.
they're using your system to prevent malicious contracted via smart contract. So I understand how it works, let's say, on a backend level that you already presented. But in terms of consensus itself, maybe you know, how they really prevent this transaction to happen on chain, let's say, if it's not custody service or it's a smart contract, it's a DEX.
Yeah.
Let's say, how do they prevent transaction from being accepted by the road?
Yeah, so when you interact with a smart contract, you can build in measures into the smart contract that gives the creator certain act powers, right? So with USDC and USDT, we see instances where they can trigger commands inside their smart contract to freeze funds inside wallets once they know it is being used by bad actors, right? So similarly with consensus, they also have the ability inside their smart contracts to blacklist wallets to prevent. So any address added into the blacklist will not be able to interact with their smart contract. So once we've identified these addresses, they would then add it to their blacklist in order to prevent interactions with it.
So let's say when the wallet matches the rule and they have a signal, they simply put this contract with another transaction.
They analyze it, they review the results, and then depending on the results, they would add it to the list and prevent future transactions.
Prevent future transactions. But
Yes.
this person have already swapped it right away, that doesn't happen.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I appreciate the questions. Hopefully you guys have as much questions for me in my subsequent sessions. But with that, I think we will, short break?
Yeah,
No-
short
no break?
Maybe about 10 minutes.
Okay, short break?
More questions, you can go to.
Yeah, and then I will be in the corner for anybody that wants to find me for more information.